Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the revolt against bad King John. In this episode, Creating Magna Carta, we will talk about the rise of bad King John, how he ruled over a society divided between a French aristocracy and English subjects, how he lost his ancestral homeland of Normandy, raised taxes again and again to pay for a war to reclaim it, and then when John squandered that money, the barons' demand for change became irresistible. King John was born on the Christmas Eve of 1166 at Beaumont Palace, the youngest of 5 sons born to King Henry II of England and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. When John was very young, his parents turned him over to a wet nurse and sent him to live at Fontevraud Abbey in France. As the 5th son, John would inherit little land, so his parents likely expected him to enter the church. Indeed, John's father, Henry II, gave John the nickname Lackland. However, 3 of John's elder brothers, including Henry the Younger and Geoffrey, both died young, so John was promoted to Duke of Aquitaine. In 1189, John's father Henry II died, and his oldest surviving son, King Richard the Lionheart, soon set out on crusade. John immediately began conniving to seize the throne by offering to ally with King Philip Augustus of France. This plan failed when King Richard returned just as civil war loomed between John and Richard's loyalists. Richard gave John a royal pardon, asserting that his 27-year-old brother was just a child, being led astray by evil advisors. Richard then spent the next 5 years defending his holdings in France from Philip Augustus before he died in battle, leaving John on the throne, unfortunately. While John may have been King of England, it was the continent that interested him. In the 160 years since the Norman conquest, Norman families had dominated England. At the time, half of England was owned by just 200 French-speaking Norman families, with the rest of the land belonging to the crown or the church. The Norman aristocracy was fed by the toil of the native English serfs. Traces of this divide between working English speakers and aristocratic French speakers can be found in modern English. Live animals who require constant work are called English names like sheep, cow, and swine, while cooked meat on the table of French-speaking overlords went by the French words mutton, veal, and pork. Indeed, John didn't speak a word of English himself, and likely regarded the English with nothing but contempt. For him, the empire that mattered wasn't England, but Aquitaine, Anjou, and of course his ancestral homeland of Normandy. Of course, John needed an heir to inherit that empire after his death. So, John divorced his childless wife Isabella of Gloucester and married Isabella of Angoulême, then only 15 years old. However, another Norman magnate, Hugh de Lusignan, also wished to marry her. So he protested to King Philip Augustus, claiming that King John was stealing his bride. King Philip Augustus used this as an excuse to seize John's lands in France. War soon began between King John and King Philip. In an early victory, John captured 250 French knights, among them his own nephew Arthur of Brittany, who may have hoped to take the throne of England for himself. At first, John wanted Arthur blinded and castrated, but many of the great magnates protested against this barbaric plan. Seething with anger, John had Arthur transferred to one of his own castles at Rouen, murdered his own nephew, and then bound the corpse to a stone before throwing it into the river Seine. This signaled to all the barons that John was a dangerous tyrant who must be taken seriously. However, John was not taken seriously as a war captain. By 1204, John lost a series of battles to Philip Augustus and lost his ancestral homeland of Normandy in the process. To the Norman barons of England, this was an utter disaster. They had to choose between their estates in England and their estates in Normandy, and then move their family seat as needed. Needless to say, many of the Anglo-Norman families lost a lot of land after the loss of Normandy. John immediately set about raising taxes needed to reclaim Normandy. Now, traditionally, the king had the wartime right to demand help in the form of money or service, especially from the nobility. However, John went far beyond the usual dues. For example, landowners had to pay an inheritance tax called relief to take an estate after their father's death. Many of these so-called reliefs came to 100 or 200 shillings, but John imposed fines of thousands of shillings for noble sons to acquire family estates. John also abused the right of the crown to manage estates if an heir was underage, and also pocket the revenues while doing so. John held on to estates years after it should have gone to the heirs, and then still forced the heir to pay relief. And it wasn't just the barons who suffered. John's men once tore a tooth from the mouth of a wealthy Bristol merchant every day until the merchant paid 6,000 shillings for the privilege of keeping his remaining teeth. Kings Henry and Richard had raised about 20,000 to 25,000 pounds a year from England, and John's exchequer raised about 64,000 a year. John took so much money from his subjects that he caused a coin shortage within England. Then John used this money to finance a war to retake Normandy. John bought alliances with the Holy Roman Emperor Renaud of Boulogne and the Count of Flanders. Since many of John's angry, and often broke, vassals refused to serve him, John instead hired mercenaries. Despite his initial success in the county of Anjou, John was soon defeated by King Philip at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, which ended John's hope of retaking Normandy. John returned to England in October of 1214, and in an act of astonishing arrogance, John pressed for a new round of taxes for a new war in Normandy. There was widespread refusal to pay anything, both among the nobles and ordinary people. After 10 years of crippling taxes and nothing to show for it but another disastrous defeat, the barons wanted change, and they wanted it now. Typically, medieval rebels challenged the king by supporting an heir or rival claimant to the throne. However, John's own children were too young to be considered, and Arthur of Brittany was too dead to wear the crown. That introduced a problem for the rebel lords. How could they convince other people to join them, risking their lives and fortunes in doing so? So the king's enemies invented a program of reform. To win as much support as they could, the barons drew up a charter of liberties for all the freemen of the realm. Of course, the word freeman only applied to people of means, not toiling peasants. Freemen probably made up less than half the population of England. Indeed, 14 of the first 15 clauses of what would become Magna Carta referred to the rights of property owners, the same men squeezed so hard by John. Only one clause mentioned peasants, and that clause said the king could not impose a fine so heavy that peasants would have to stop farming, which would, of course, hit the barons in the pocketbook. It's worth noting that while John issued the charter to archbishops, abbots, earls, barons, justiciaries, foresters, sheriffs, bailiffs, and many other persons of rank, 60 of the 63 clauses in Magna Carta referred solely to the aristocracy. Nonetheless, the document worked marvelously as propaganda. The city of London was so taken by the idea of Magna Carta that they opened its gates to the rebels in May 1215. William Marshal, revered as the greatest knight in Europe and the second most powerful man in England, supported the rebels' program of reform. King John realized that he had to play for time until he could get help from his ally Pope Innocent III. So on June 15th, 1215, King John agreed to the rebels' terms at Runnymede and set his seal on Magna Carta. Of course, John saw this as a temporary concession until he had the chance to break his promise, and we will see how he does that in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this installment of the Legendarium. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.